Okay, welcome to video number 3 in my explanation or attempt at an explanation to describe how the electromagnetic force is both important to automotive technology and also how it actually fits in with all the other forces and hopefully eliminates some confusion when we're talking about electromagnetic force. These videos won't be very good for actually answering specific questions like you might find in your textbook, but they are pretty good for understanding generally how electromagnetism fits into the automotive world. Video number 3 is entitled, oops, let me select my pen. Video number 3 is entitled WTF, and I believe this is the Greek sign for gamma question mark. So the title of the video is WTF, which we all know what that means. Then the symbol for a photon. This little Y symbol is the symbol for a photon. And the purpose of this video is to really address two questions that a lot of people have, and that is how does the photon mediate the electromagnetic force? So that's question 1. How does the photon mediate the electromagnetic force? And notice that I did not say how does the photon control the magnetic force. No. The photon is something that is associated with the electromagnetic force, and it is something obviously that exists in a vehicle or all around us. So why do people say that this photon mediates the electromagnetic force? And the other question is, why is everything EMF? Now, why do I make this statement? Why is everything actually the electromagnetic force? And the reason has to do with one of scale. Now, you may have heard, and I probably have said in the last 2 videos, that when we talk about forces acting on a car, we talk about things like friction force, force of momentum or inertial force, rotational force, cranking force, and comments have been made by, for example, scientists, or maybe an offhanded comment by a professor or even by me, that actually all these forces, inertial, cranking force, all these forces are actually the electromagnetic force, not any of the other forces. And you'll remember that I described 4 other forces: weak nuclear, strong nuclear, gravity, and electromagnetism. Electromagnetism is, when we talk about inertial force, frictional force, or really any other force that has to do with the car, it is ultimately all the electromagnetic force. And why do I say that? Well, as I said, it's a question of scale. So that's boring, but let's talk about why does Big Al say everything is actually the electromagnetic force? So let's take a look at the actual forces as we've discussed them before. So here in this column, I'm just going to draw the forces that we know and love already. So the first force we have is, of course, gravity. The first force we have is gravity. And if we examine our memories, we will notice that we also have 2 other forces, discussed them very briefly, mentioned them. We have the strong nuclear force nuclear force. We have the weak nuclear force. Whoops. The weak nuclear. And then, of course, last but not least, we have electromagnetism. We'll just call electromagnetism EM. And you will recall from my previous videos that way back in time we had electricity and magnetism. Those were unified around the turn of the century, in the 1900s. And in 1993, I believe, the weak nuclear force was unified with the electromagnetic force. So we have these forces. Well, let's give these forces a name or a symbol for each force. We'll call this the symbol. These are not the official symbols by any means, but I'm trying to get kind of close. So, of course, gravity, we'll give that a G. The strong nuclear force will give a nice, crisp capital N. The weak nuclear force will give a little n. And the electromagnetic force, why don't we just give that an E? Okay, so when we talk about these forces, we also need to talk about what is the range of the force. And interestingly enough, if you want to get very technical, the range of all of these forces is infinite. So if we have a force of gravity acting, it will exert its influence infinitely over all of space and time. Same with the strong and weak nuclear forces. Their range is infinite. This is my bad infinity symbol. Infinite, infinite, and electromagnetic range is also infinite. Gravity, for example, gravity has a scale that operates on or up to massive distances. Oops, two S's in massive. Massive distance and massive size. So gravity, as you can see here, effectively operates on large scales. If we then switch our attention to the nuclear forces, both the strong and nuclear forces work on tiny distances and tiny size. And it's exactly the same for the weak nuclear force. Tiny distance, tiny size. Now, if you're big into physics, you're going to notice some opportunities to correct me when I'm talking about the strong nuclear and the weak nuclear force, but really it has no bearing on automotive. So my crappy description of the strong and weak nuclear forces will have to do. Finally, the electromagnetic force. Well, again, its range is infinite, but effectively it works on the human scale. And that is why every single force, effectively, that we're talking about in a car or just anywhere in reality, in everyday life, is really part and parcel of the electromagnetic force. Okay, but Al, so to better understand the scales that the four fundamental forces worked on, we created this chart where we identified the four fundamental forces. We gave them some symbols, which we just made up, G, N, little n, and E. We stated the range of these forces is really infinite, but effectively not infinite. So yes, the gravitational force will extend from planet Earth out to the edge of the universe. However, the effective range that it works on, or the scale, is not infinite. And we briefly mentioned why do we see, well, gravity we obviously feel the effects of, but gravity works on big distances and big sizes, whereas the strong and weak nuclear forces work on microscopic, tiny, like talking atom-sized distances, so tiny distances and tiny sizes. And finally, electromagnetism, we see that, well, electromagnetism operates on the human scale, as opposed to just on the very large scale or visibly only on the tiny scale. And that is why electromagnetism is really the fundamental force that is every single force that you are dealing with in a vehicle, for example. So both your kinetic force, your frictional force, and of course your electric force, all is actually electromagnetic. To understand this a little better, we can draw a sort of diagram. So to better understand the scales that these forces work on, let's draw ourselves a little chart, and let's not use a lot of math, but let's try to understand the scale that the four fundamental forces operate on. So here, let's say we have down here, let's say we have distance. And here, let's just say we have strength. And all we're trying to do is come up with a visual understanding of why forces that we know, the four fundamental forces, operate in different arenas, in different scales. So if we talk about gravity, okay, when we're talking very small distances, obviously gravity is quite strong. So when we're very close together, two objects exert a lot of gravity. But as they move further apart, the strength of the gravitational attraction between those two objects diminishes with time. So let's see if I can draw so this is probably not accurate at all in terms of the actual relationship between distance and strength of gravity, but the chart as a whole will give you an idea. And what this is saying is at very short distances, right here, so two objects are very close together, the strength of the gravitational pull right up here will be very strong. As the distance increases between those two objects, the strength of gravity, as you can see here, always gets weaker, and this goes out forever and ever and ever. But the reason I say, yes, the range is infinite, but the scale on which it operates isn't, because obviously the Earth's gravitational effect on, say, a galaxy, the galaxy of Andromeda, is minimal. It has an effect, but it's minimal. It's way over here at effectively close to zero. Now, if we think about the nuclear force, that is a little different. So we have the strong and the weak nuclear force, and they kind of also are very, very, very strong if the two objects are very close together. But unlike gravitational force, the nuclear force, strong or weak really, is very strong at very tiny distances. And as soon as those tiny, oops, I'm obviously using the wrong color pen. Okay, so strong and weak nuclear force. I don't want to get too much into the difference between them, but strong and weak nuclear forces, just as their name implies, they operate in the nucleus of an atom, and they are super strong at very close distances, but really super weak as soon as you get to a distance that's any greater than the size of an atom. So again, range infinite, but the scale on which it operates, not infinite, really tiny scales. And then finally we have electricity. Electricity kind of works the same, but slightly different. It's very, very strong at high scales, and it does get weaker at distances, but very slowly weaker. So again, remember, so this is electricity. Remember, all of the four fundamental forces operate at a range of infinite in actuality. However, in effectiveness, they have certain scales where they belong. Electromagnetism is more on the human scale, so you can see here the energy doesn't really dissipate, and gravity works on the very massive, big objects, slowly dissipates in its strength, and the strong and weak nuclear forces work at very tiny scales, and the force of their strength, the strength of those forces, rapidly diminishes to effectively nothing if you get to a size that's greater than the size of an atom, so tiny. And that is why we only really notice the four fundamental forces. That is why we only really notice the electrical force. Obviously, we notice the gravitational force, but it really doesn't come into a lot of play either in automotive or in anything that we experience in our day-to-day life other than sticking to the ground. So why do I say that every force is really the electrical and magnetic force? Well, it harkens back to something called the Standard Model of Particle Physics. If you'll remember, we had a periodic table of elements that I think we might have even shown it in our second to previous videos, periodic table of elements. And this table was essential in understanding electricity, but obviously also chemistry. Well, the Standard Model of Particle Physics also kind of has a periodic table, but it's not called a periodic table of the elements, it's called a Standard Model of Particle Physics. And in the Standard Model of Particle Physics, we divide up the particles that exist into two broad categories. There are the fermions and there are the bosons. Now, again, it's not the purpose of an automotive technician to understand what the difference is between fermions and bosons to the extent that a physicist would understand the difference of fermions and bosons. However, to gain, again, that basic understanding of how electrical and magnetic forces that are present in an automobile actually integrate amongst all the forces, it's essential to understand this. So the fermions include the particles that make up the stuff in our world. So fermions make up matter. And fermions are made up of quarks, they're made up of neutrinos, and they're made up of electrons. Now quarks, we haven't really discussed them before, but quarks are what is found in a neutron and a proton. Each neutron and each proton is made up of quarks, even smaller particles than the neutron or proton. So every single atom in the entire world contains neutrons, protons, and therefore quarks, and contains electrons. This is the stuff, fermions, that matter is made of. there's a whole other class of particles called bosons, and these are particles that they don't make up matter, but what I and many people call the particles that mediate the forces between matter. Some people call them force-carrying particles. I don't know if I really like that. An in-depth study into particle physics, you can see why, but regardless, they are, we'll just call them the particles that mediate the forces between the fermions. So bosons consist of W bosons and Z bosons, and again, don't really need to know about these. They don't come into play in motive technology. They've got to do with neutrinos, which is a type of matter. We have the graviton, that's a type of boson, which is right now theoretical. It does not actually, it's never been proven to exist, but they think, the hope is that the graviton will be the boson that actually controls gravity. We know there's the Higgs boson. We've identified that back in 2018, I believe. And finally, the most famous boson right now for our purposes is the photon. And it's this photon that actually mediates or is the prime driver in the electromagnetic force fields and electromagnetic energy. Photons, so fermions really, you may have heard when talking about stuff like quantum mechanics or particle physics that particles have two properties. Particles can be both wave-like, and particles can be particle-like. Now, so it's widely accepted that no matter whether you're talking about a fermion or a boson, it's let's take the example of fermions. We think of electrons and neutrons and protons, and we think of them as little point-like particles, and that's a good way to think of them because they make up matter, and matter is stuff, you can touch it. Well, so we can say the fermions, they're particle-like, but they do have some wave-like properties. We don't want to get into what those wave-like properties are, but they have some wave-like properties. Bosons can be thought of sort of as the flip category. They're also like little particles, but their particleness is less prevalent than their wave-like properties. And that can be seen because the photon is a ray of light. It's a little ray of light, a little wave coming at you. And it is much more wave-like than it is particle-like, a photon is. However, it is still particle-like. And the reason why it's particle-like is because really what a light wave is just a little wave of electromagnetic energy coming from some sort, like coming from a sun, coming from some sort of light source, and flying out in some direction. And it's a little wavy, like a sine wave. Well, it was discovered by Niels Bohr, famous scientist in the 30s, that no matter what the frequency of the light, red light, blue light, green light, ultraviolet light, infrared light, whatever type of light you're talking about, the wave itself has a minimum energy level, and this minimum energy level is called a quanta. And that is why we have the expression quantum mechanics and quantum physics. A quanta is the minimum amount of energy that can fit into a wave-like packet of energy. And this quantization can be done not only for photons, but can be done for every other particle that exists as well. So that is why I say bosons are more wave-like than particle-like, but they have both features, and fermions are more particle-like than wave-like, but they also have both features. Many people remember it like this. We have the fermions are firm like matter. So like the stuff you touch. Well, if you can touch it, it's a fermion, because a fermion is made up of neutrons, protons, electrons, and other matter-making particles. Firm. It's firm like matter. The other way, some physicists say fermions are like puppies. You can't have enough. They love being together and they love piling on top of each other. Intuitively, this makes sense because fermions, if you're touching a chunk of something, like reach over and touch your pen, you are touching a whole bunch of fermions. They like to be together. They're like puppies. Can't have too many. Bosons are like the cats of the world, and they like to be alone. Bosons don't want to be with anybody. They don't want to be touched. They want to be left alone. So that is an interesting way you can keep track of it. Now, I had thought of this great topic to discuss about why fermions and bosons behave differently, and it was about spin, but I'm not going to discuss this. Spin is not something, the spin, the angular momentum of a particle, is really not something that is necessarily needed in motive mechanics. So I'm not going to complicate the discussion and start talking about spin, but I am going to briefly discuss this crazy diagram you see here, and we're going to make it a little nicer so that it doesn't look so confusing. So I am going to eliminate this information. Okay. Just getting rid of all this, and we're going to start again. All right, so let's go back an episode or two and go back to our trusty magnet. Here's our trusty magnet. And our magnet has a north pole and it has a south pole, as we know. And for purposes of this presentation, we're going to pretend that this magnet is a natural magnet. We're not running electricity through it to make it an electromagnet. Now, I talked about before that if we're dealing with an electromagnet, we are dealing with lines of magnetic force, for purposes of this discussion, coming out of the North Pole, wrapping around, and going into the South Pole. And of course, the same thing happens on the other side of the magnet. And these lines are everywhere and all around the magnet. These lines of electromagnetic force. Now, what's really happening here? What is this electromagnetic force? It's actually a photon. It's not a photon in the spectrum of visible light, but it is a photon that is moving around. You can't see it, but it's this photon that is creating these lines of force that exist from the North Pole to the South Pole of the magnet. Well, this may not help much, but you can get an intuitive understanding of this by let's draw how. Let's think about Feynman diagrams. Now, Feynman was a scientist in the 60s, a physicist in California, very famous person, very smart guy, obviously, and he came up with a way to understand Feynman, I'm not sure if I'm spelling him right, diagrams. He came up with a way to understand how particles are actually, certain particles, the bosons, are actually the particles that mediate the forces. And this is done by using a concept called virtual particles. So what Feynman does is he says, okay, this is really easy. Let's imagine there's an electron. Here's my electron. And this electron is going in this direction, traveling along. And it gets to this point, and something happens, and then it goes off in this direction. And just so we're clear, time is moving in this direction. So this is time. Okay. We also have another electron here. He's moving in this direction. Something happens here, and then he bounces off and goes here. So this electron is coming around. This electron, just let's imagine it's the electron that's in a copper wire conducting electricity. So this electron is part of the copper atom. Let's pretend it's the atom in the outer valence shell that's free and that wants to move over to the next valence shell to get that current flowing down the wire. Well, the current's going to flow down the wire. The electron is going to brush up close to the spot where the other electron is, and there's going to be an exchange of a photon. And this is the virtual particle. And this is the exchange of the photon which causes this electron to move off in the other direction and this electron to move off in the opposite direction. And this is what is transmitting that electrical force down the wire. This is how Feynman explains it using Feynman diagrams and virtual particles. Finally and lastly in this topic, another way to understand this force mediation of the photon is just to imagine you've got your atom here, and it's a boat. There's one boat, there's another boat. These boats are sitting in the water. And on this boat, there's a guy. And on this boat, there's another guy. Now, what you're thinking is that each of these boats is an atom. The atom in the wire. Now, this guy has a basketball. And this guy has a basketball. And so this boat with the guy on it is an atom. This guy with a boat on it, with a boat under him, is an atom. Each of them are carrying a basketball. So imagine these basketballs are photons. So what happens when this guy in the boat throws his basketball to this guy in the boat, and this guy in the boat throws his basketball over to this guy in the boat, and they each catch it? Well, I'll tell you what happens. Both boats are going to move away from each other. And that is how for example, photon mediates the electrical force. This can also happen in reverse. So you can have for example, your two boats again. I'm going to try drawing that one all over again. You can have your two boats again. Here's one boat. Here's the guy in one boat. Here's the other boat. You know what? I'm going to draw my little boat closer. Here's the guy in the little boat. No. So to draw this another way, just think about this going in the opposite direction. So you can have your here's one boat. Here's another boat. Here's your first guy on the first boat and your second guy on the second boat. Now each of those guys, instead of a basketball, they've got a boomerang. And this guy throws his boomerang over here to this guy. And this guy throws his boomerang over here to the other guy. And that's going to cause both these boats to move into each other. And that is how the photon can mediate the force between these two atoms. Essentially how it mediates the force between electrical, how it mediates the electromagnetic force. So to close up this presentation, really what we're seeing here is the difference between fermions and bosons are what creates the feature of all forces that operate on a human scale are really the electromagnetic force, and the feature of the electromagnetic force being the one force that is really prevalent on the human scale, making the electromagnetic force the force that we're all just naturally the most familiar with. And so we have the particles mediating the force, and there are tons of examples of this. For example, the greatest example you can see is this boat example is illustrated when there's a lightning storm. So what you have is, you've got your clouds up here, and you've got the ground here, and you've got lightning coming down and striking the ground. Well, the lightning is clearly an electromagnetic force, and what you're seeing is a current going from the cloud down to the ground when the lightning strikes the ground, because the lightning is trying to get back to its source, which is in the ground. And why do you see this flash of lightning? That's because there's the little photon. You are seeing the photon in action when you see the lightning flash. You are seeing the photon mediating the electrical force between the atmosphere and the ground. It's a similar reason to why, for example, if you have a block, I shouldn't say it's a similar reason. So here we have a visible example of photons creating, of photons mediating the electromagnetic force. You can see it mediating the electromagnetic force. And you can see an example of the different types of fermions and bosons. You can see an example of the different types of particles simply by considering, for example, you can simply consider you've got your chunk of matter, block of wood, doesn't matter, it could be anything at all, and you're putting it on top of the table. It does not sink through or get absorbed by the table. It stops right there. And that is because of, at the end of the day, what we're really having are atoms of two different surfaces touching each other. So we've got the atom of the block, here's the nucleus, here's the electron. Let's just pretend there's one electron. And then, of course, we have the atom of the table that it's touching, these guys don't go past each other. These guys are not wanting to be in contact with each other. They are being kept apart by these electrons. It's these electrons that are keeping the atom apart. And remember, this electron here has a negative charge. This electron here also has a negative charge. Like charges push each other apart. And that's what bosons do. Every piece of matter has electrons floating around it, so every piece of matter doesn't want to get absorbed by some different piece of matter. We're getting too deep into chemistry here, but we have a real-life example here of the different types of particles, and 1 second ago we had a real-life example somewhere up here of lightning, a real-life example of actually visually seeing the photon meet a boson, mediating the electromagnetic force. So make sure you check the links in the description, because they will contain some excellent videos that you should watch from a channel called The Engineering Mindset, and from somebody else as well, but excellent videos that really use computer technology, excellent to describe actual real-life electrical stuff like starter motors in cars. Thanks very much, and thanks for watching.